Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you, whichever part of the world you reside in. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on food systems for individual and planetary health. My name is Shakti Saran, and I'm the founder of SHAKTIFY, a think tank to power social and environmental change, and an initiative to support change makers. The Greek philosopher Hippocrates had said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." Food is what makes us what we are. It is responsible for our energy, for our survival, even our quest for pleasure. And from food, we derive well-being and illnesses, not just for ourselves, but also for our beloved planet. I'm delighted to have Morag Gamble and Peter Lehner with us today. Morag and Peter, welcome to this webinar. Thank you. It is wonderful to have you with us today. So Morag is a global ambassador for regenerative food systems and founder of the Permaculture Education Institute and the CEO of Ethos Foundation. She is a teacher, lecturer, gardener, and a social worker. She teaches educators and designers across 6 continents and in centers like Schumacher College, and is a lecturer on food politics. She lives in an eco-village in Queensland, Australia. Morag holds a postgraduate diploma in landscape architecture from the University of Melbourne and a master's in environmental and sustainability education from Griffith University. She is also an alum of Schumacher College, England, and Fritjof Capra's Capra course. Peter Lehner is a managing attorney of Earthjustice's Sustainable Food and Farming Program. He has previously served as the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council and the chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's Office. Peter teaches food systems and environmental law at Columbia and Yale Law Schools. He has a BA from Harvard in philosophy and mathematics and a JD from Columbia Law School. He is on the boards of the Rainforest Alliance and Environmental Advocates New York. Along with 2 other families, Peter's family owns coffee farms, which he helps manage. I also want to welcome our audience today. I'm pleased to share that we have over 120 registrations from 20 countries across the world besides India, ranging from Australia to Uganda and from New Zealand to the United States to Malawi. I just wanted to make an announcement or 2 before we get started. The first is that if you have a question to pose to our panelists, please post it directly on the Q&A chat. The Q&A has been enabled. Please do not post your questions on the general chat as it is going to be unmonitored. Also, closed captions have been enabled for this webinar. If you would like to download a copy of the transcript of the chat, you're welcome to do so before you exit. So we're now going to get started with the webinar, and we're going to get started with a few introductory questions that I will be posing to both Morag and Peter on their personal journeys before we get into the main webinar discussion. And in about 40 to 45 minutes from now, we will open up the webinar to audience questions. And we will close the webinar 1 hour and 15 minutes from our start time. So I have a question for both of you, Morag and Peter. Yeah, what does food mean? What does food mean to you?
I'll jump in first there, Peter. Thank you. And thank you for hosting this session, and welcome to everyone who's here in the group. It's lovely to be part of this conversation today. I'm calling in from Gubbi Gubbi country in Australia, and it's a delight to be here. It's my evening time. So food is everything. Food is the way that I connect with nature. Food is the way that I connect with all the issues in the world, because I've landed with focusing on food because it connects us all. Unless you're a breatharian, you have a relationship with food. And so we can talk about absolutely everything through food. And so for me, it is my portal to the world of communicating about the things that matter to me most.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Morag. Peter, what does food mean to you?
Well, first I'll echo what Morag said. Great to be here. It's great to be here I'm calling in from New York City, where it's our early morning. And I have been all my life an environmental lawyer. And so I came really to focus on the food system more recently because of its huge impact on everything environmental lawyers care about. Our air, our water, our species, our land, our climate, our personal health, our community health. And it is often not thought of as an environmental issue. One thinks about factories, but in fact, it is a food system that affects our individual and planetary health really more than anything else, as well as shapes our communities. So it's a great opportunity to work on this issue.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that. So I have a question now for you, Morag. Tell us about your journey setting up Permaculture Education Institute. What made you conceive and implement that?
The Permaculture Education Institute focuses on teaching permaculture teachers, and I've come to that realization because what I understand the world needs more than anything is more eco-literacy and more eco-design. And if we are to systemically shift what's happening, we need to offer systemic solutions. And this needs to be accessible anywhere and everywhere. And the most, I guess, sort of democratic form of eco-literacy and eco-design that I know of is permaculture. And so it's been a platform to be able to share it from refugee communities to New York rooftops to eco-villages and school grounds everywhere. And really actually inspired tremendously from spending a lot of time in Ladakh up in the Himalayas, where everything came from the earth and went back to the earth, and spending time at Schumacher College, where thinking about the ecological paradigm and how understanding how there needs to be a shift in the way we perceive the issues in front of us and how we can respond to them. And then to come back into my own home country here in Australia and go, well, how are we to live? What does it mean to live well? How are we to live in a way that is tending to the well-being of this one beautiful planet that we live on? You know, if everyone lived like a typical Australian, we'd need 4 planets, and we just don't have that. So permaculture is a way for me to express one planet living, and permaculture education is a way to share that as widely as possible.
So this is much more than a profession. It's a way of life. Yeah, permaculture. Yeah, thank you.
Indeed. Yes.
Thank you, Morag. So Peter, ever since I've known you, you've been associated with the environment, and that is like a very long period. But you're also a part-time a part-time farmer. You've been an environmental lawyer, but now a part-time farmer. At what stage in your life did you take to managing a farm, and how has this shaped you as a person?
Thanks, but I'm going to first actually add a moment to what Morag said. Is when I started focusing on agriculture's impact and food systems' impact on the environment, there was very little written about it, and a lot that was written about it was partial or frankly somewhat misleading. And so being a lawyerly type, I studied and read a lot. And then in the course of that, understood or learned how important perennial agriculture is, and how really extraordinarily focused on annual agriculture much of our food policies are. Annual crops, whether in the US, corn, soybean, wheat, but that the possibilities of permaculture or perennial agriculture are just extraordinary and wildly underappreciated. So it's really a delight to be here with Morag with that focus, because it is, I think, one of the great and misunderstood opportunities. For myself, I see that as a farmer. Our main farm is a coffee farm, and coffee is a tree that lives maybe 30 years. It may live longer, but usually after 30 years, you think of replacing it. So it's a crop that also lives underneath shade trees, which are also long-lived. So it's a permaculture operation. And the exciting part of that is when we got involved, when my family got involved, I was very young. And then when I started getting personally involved, I didn't know a lot about coffee farming, but I knew enough to think that we probably weren't doing it the very ecologically sound way. And so we looked around and found a group that was then called Eco-OK. It's now called the Rainforest Alliance, that had, I recall, 70 pages of how to be more ecologically sustainable. And so we shifted to that, and I think we've now been Rainforest Alliance certified for 25 years. But the exciting part of that has been able, on a personal level, to try to run a farm that is ecologically really a model. We've had people from all around the world come to see what we do, and also provide a good living for everyone who works on the farm. The farm sort of surrounds a small town, and shows that it can be done. And that then helps my advocacy, my day job, advocating for policies that would help more sustainable farming practices.
Thank you, Peter. And I hope that people will emulate what you've done, because I think there's so much to learn from your story. In fact, from both of your stories. Thank you, Morag and Peter, for being great guardians of planet Earth. We need more people like you on this planet. So I'm now going to get into the main discussion of our webinar, and this is. It has been structured around the objectives of this webinar. So let me just quickly recap what those objectives are. So the first thing what we're trying to achieve here in this webinar is to bring about a heightened sense of consciousness on contemporary challenges that we face that are related to our food systems. And it's targeted at a typical urban audience. Yeah, that's the first objective. The second objective is we want to try and dig a little deeper and understand the web of causes that are responsible for what ails us today. And in the process, we will go over some of the trends and the counter trends that we have witnessed over the last 5 or 6 decades. And the third objective really is, to envision what we see could be the future of food systems and unearth insights on not just what needs to be changed, but how should we go about, introducing this change. So for the first part that we are now commencing, we're going to speak on some of the personal health challenges, the social challenges, the environmental challenges that we're witnessing related to food systems. And just for all of us to be clear, when I say food systems, we refer to all types of systems: industrial, organic, agroecological food systems. And these encompass not just plant-based agriculture, but also animal husbandry and fishing. So I'm going to begin with you, Morag, and I'm going to ask you a question or two on personal health. What do you see as being some of the personal health challenges that are associated with industrial food today?
Well, I've just come from a fabulous meeting this morning with food systems advocates here in Australia, and they told me about this study that has been done, and that they went around, collected 600 carrots and tested the nutritional value of these carrots grown in all different contexts. And they came up and they found that there was a 200 times difference in the antioxidants in the different types of carrots. Extraordinary difference. And so what we see in the industrial food system is there may be greater levels of yield, but the nutrient density is far lower. The micronutrients, the macronutrients, the proteins, the wheat that is grown now has 50% less protein than it did when it first started being grown. The changes in the kind of food that is being produced in the industrial system is meaning it's of diminished quality and diminished nutrient density. And above and beyond that too, because of all the chemical load that's on the food, it's deeply affecting our gut microbiome, and we understand the huge impact that that's having on our health. And statistics are sort of saying that over 60% of deaths in society now are preventable from things like diet. And so our food system is deeply affecting our health, and particularly because it's affecting water, it's affecting soil, it's affecting air, it's affecting the workers' health. Chronic disease in farming communities is going up. So while the point was that the industrial agriculture system was meant to help to avoid hunger and poverty, it's actually ended up undermining the very things that support the health and well-being of people and the planet.
And Morag, can you also share some light on the connection between social justice and sustainable food systems? I mean, why do you give so much of emphasis on this in your work?
Well, let's just take seed, for example. More than half of the world's seed is owned by 4 companies. Much of the wealth that's being extracted from the food system goes to a handful of companies. It's become incredibly disproportionate in terms of where money goes. Yet still, most of the people most of the food that's grown in the world is actually from small scale farmers. But yet most of the wealth that's extracted goes to a few people. And from the increased size of industrial farming systems, it means that people have been taken off their land and becoming almost like slave labor in large industrial farming systems without any rights, without any health protections. And so it's actually completely destroyed communities and destroyed the health and well-being and destroyed the agency of people who were once food secure and had sovereignty over their food system.
Right.
So I just think the injustices in terms of the economic system and how that's played out has become increasingly unbalanced, and it's kind of one of the core parts of why it needs to change.
True. I think in India, we have seen almost 300,000 farmer suicides in the last 20 years, right? And that is to the point that you raised about seeds and economic domination. Yeah, we're going to try and come back to that, to some of these social challenges a little later. Peter, I want to move on to you. And you've done, a fair amount of work, and you're also an author, Peter, and you've done a fair amount of work in farming as well as in the environment. Can you share with us quickly what you see as being the top 3 environmental consequences of unchecked industrial farming?
Sure, but first, again, I'm going to comment on something Morag said, which is I was shocked to learn in the United States that actually our food system now drives more poor health than smoking, which, if you pause for a moment, is really pretty extraordinary. We all know that smoking is terrible, and you're just ingesting a known carcinogen. But that our food system that is supposed to nourish us is actually causing more harm than smoking is, I think, a telling point. In terms of the environmental consequences, I think the one that we most have to think about is climate change, because the food system is also dependent on climate change, or on hopefully less climate change. And when we think of climate change, it's usually factories or cars burning fossil fuels, releasing carbon dioxide. And of course, agriculture's contribution to climate change comes from very different sources. It's largely cows that are, or cattle that are belching methane all the time because of the way their guts work. Especially in countries like the US and perhaps a little less in India, but the vast numbers of animals we produce an even vaster amount of manure, of waste. And unlike human waste that is treated in most areas with sewage treatment plants, this is just left to rot, really, in pits and then spread on soils, releasing tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases. And all the land that is used for agriculture has been deforested or converted from native grasslands with tremendous climate impact. And with the result that the food system, when you add it all up, contributes as much to climate change as our transportation system. Probably a third or more of climate change comes from food. And yet, very few climate policies are addressing food. That's beginning to change a tiny bit. Next week, I'm accompanying with a UN General Assembly meeting in New York City. We have what's called Climate Week. And a couple of years ago, there would have been virtually no panels or discussion of the food system. And now at Climate Week, there are some. I would guess it's still well less than 10% of the attention, and certainly well less than 10% of the money or effort. But we're beginning to understand. And so one is that we really have to make clear that if we don't address the food system, we're going to face catastrophic climate change no matter how successful we are with decarbonizing the rest of society. I think the second environmental issue that is so important is water use and water pollution. Again, we need water to live. And in many areas, it is largely agriculture that is poisoning our water. In the United States, which I'm more familiar with, our Clean Water Act has done a good job, really, of cleaning up industrial water pollution and a terrible job of addressing agricultural water pollution. So it's really now agriculture's water pollution, pesticides, soil runoff, nutrient runoff, that is the largest cause of water pollution, with tremendous health impacts, ecological impacts, and others. And it's not just pollution, it's use of water. Agriculture uses tremendous amounts of water, often horrifically inefficiently. And the big part of that is animal agriculture, but in many other ways. So by thinking differently about our food system, we can have tremendous impact on our water, which is absolutely critical. And then the last I would say is agriculture uses most of our land. If you've ever look down, if you fly anywhere, what do? You see agriculture. In the US, it uses almost 2/3 of the contiguous US is agricultural land. And that means it is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, as well as the chemical. So if you think about that we share this planet with other species, you got to think about the food system.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. That is very enlightening. I have an associated question with you, for you on, on industrial farming. And, it goes back to the 70s. So when I was growing up, people like Norman Borlaug, who was the Nobel Prize, Peace awardee, and his protege, M.S. Swaminathan, they were looked upon here in India as heroes. And, Norman Borlaug had gone on record saying that, without food, man can live at most for, a few weeks. And without it, all other components of social justice are meaningless. So in this entire narrative, where does food security come in? Are we, whilst we're looking at the whole agriculture discussion, can you also throw light on what does food security mean? Is this something that we could just, dispense away with? Was the Green Revolution in some way or the other, did it not contribute to alleviating hunger and building food security? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to hit the second part first, food security, we all hope that people can feel secure that they're going to have enough food for themselves and their families. I think it's important to understand it is not a question in most countries that I'm familiar with of enough food. It's a question of food distribution. In the United States, and actually in most other countries, we actually waste 1/3 of the food we produce. In other words, we produce much, much more food than people actually eat. And the fact that people are still hungry is not a question that we don't have the food. It's just that we're not getting it to them. And our economic system of the food system is not working. In terms of the Green Revolution, on the one hand, that certainly one progress can be a good thing in many ways. But as Morag said, to the extent that we think of the yields of commodity crops above everything else, and the only way we think of the food system is more bushels of corn per acre, and we don't think about all the other ways the food system affects our lives and the planet, then we have a very impoverished view of our goals. And so I'm not sure it's fair to blame that on Norman Borlaug. I don't know enough of the history, but what has happened since is that policy focuses just on productivity at all costs, at all environmental costs and social costs, and not thinking about the rest of the food system.
Understand. So that is, in other words, food reductionism that we are seeing, and looking at food in yields in isolation of everything else, all the other consequences that food production is leading to. So I have an associated question for you on this. Was there an equivalent to the Green Revolution in animal farming? Because when we speak about the Green Revolution, it's largely about plant-based farming. Was there any equivalent of this in animal farming?
There really was, and it's unfortunate. One thinks that farm animals grow grazing on pastures and having some access to the environment. Again, I'm more familiar with the United States, but in the United States, about 98%, 99% of our animals are not raised like that now. They're raised in what we call concentrated animal feeding operations, which one may think of as an animal factory. Right. Where these are huge buildings that may hold tens of thousands of animals, or maybe even millions of chickens. And those animals probably never see the light of day. They often have virtually no room to move around. Feed is fed to them and antibiotics are fed to them. And in these cramped, unsanitary conditions, they go from birth to death. And it is essentially a factory, but instead of having stamping presses or I don't know what, baling machines, they use animals. And that's the way virtually all of our animals are raised. And this is new. This is really came about first in chickens in the 1970s, and then it expanded to pork and expanded since to cattle. I think it started largely in the US, but it has very much spread into Europe and into South America, and is probably spreading everywhere. So it is absolutely a change in animal production that has gone from what we may think in our heads as farming to factories.
I think it's interesting too to note, just to jump in there, that almost 70% of the grain that's grown in the world is actually grown to feed the animals in these farming factory systems. So all of that forest clearing, the biodiversity loss, if we actually didn't have such a system of massive animal production like that, we wouldn't need to be clearing as many forests. And that, of all that meat that's produced in that, only 50% of it's actually turned into food. So there's just losses. Like this system of industrial intensive agriculture is not efficient. It's not actually producing more out of the small amount that we can start with. And the other thing just to keep in mind, just as a little sort of a interesting fact, is that 70% of the mass of birds on the planet are now chickens. Of all birds on the planet, 70% of the mass is now chickens, and 96% of the mass of mammals is now livestock and humans. And so through this animal farming system, we've completely put the balance of life out of whack.
Thank you for bringing that out, Morag. It's great that you're bringing out the significance of the amount of land that is being used only for animal farming, which is a lesser known fact. Most people are not really aware of that. They don't think about that. It's that much of agriculture, the general notion is a lot of agriculture is being used to feed humans, but then there is a substantially larger portion that is being used to actually feed animals. Right, so that's an incredible insight. So thank you for that. So Morag, whilst we've been speaking about the Green Revolution, I've also been thinking about the whole permaculture movement. And I remember when you had addressed us in one of our community gatherings, you had spoken about the genesis of permaculture. And my question to you first is, just for the benefit of our audience who may not be fully familiar with permaculture, can you just briefly tell us what exactly is permaculture?
Sure. So permaculture originally came from the combination of two words, permanent agriculture, but has come more to become known as permanent culture, really looking at how we can design sustainable, regenerative human systems that live in balance. So it began in the 1970s as a direct response to what at that time was, there was oil crises, there was economic crises, there was bushfire crises, there was lots of global instability, there was threat of nuclear war. There's all sorts of things going on that, if you think about now, today, with our multiple crises, our polycrisis that's happening, it felt the same back then. And permaculture was a direct response to all of those things, to say, okay, if that doesn't make sense, then what? And so it was looking at how we can relocalize the food systems, build in the resilience, focus on rewilding, acknowledging that actually these patterns of destruction of the natural world which supported us was unsustainable. We knew this 50 years ago. We knew it even before then. And so mapping out what a regenerative way of life is like, so that we could protect the forest, regenerate the damage that was done, find more energy efficient, high yielding, but sustainable ways of living and nourishing the human population in balance with regenerating the biodiversity that was already being recognized as being massively lost. So this is 50 years ago. And I think it's come a long way. Permaculture has rippled to pretty much every country in the world. You don't have to look too far to find people who have understanding of this. It's been translated into just about every language. It's being localized. You see it now in the design of organizations, design of schools, university classes, as well as farms, gardens. It's relevant as much in an urban context as it is in a farm. And the eco-village, the human settlement that I live in, is designed using principles of permaculture as well, foregrounding the regeneration of the river systems and the steep slopes, protecting the agricultural land first, and then putting the human systems in a way that we get good solar so that we don't need to have extra lighting and air conditioning. It's designed in a way that it's energy efficient, it's nature positive, and it brings food, farming, and nature conservation all together with, human settlements, rather than going, okay, food's here, nature's here, and people's here. So I think that connection, it's about the intersection between our systems and seeing the whole systems of humanity together. So at its core, just to finish up, these three core ethics, which are earth care, people care, and fair share. So really bringing the social justice in. But the fair share is not just about social justice, it's also thinking about future generations, other species. So what's happening in the more than human world. So, but at the very heart is this planetary care, that, we have this one planet that is our home, and we are nature, recognizing that we are nature, and everything we do must kind of emanate from that understanding.
So when permaculture was introduced, was it in some ways a response to the Green Revolution, a counter to the Green Revolution?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. The Green Revolution, the damming of rivers, the cutting of forests, all of the things that were seen to be happening at that time too. I remember being incredibly activated by massive dust storms that were happening in Australia, because the erosion of the landscape, the desertification that was happening. So a key part of permaculture is about rehydrating the landscape, regenerating the soils, bringing back the perennial crops that can hold the land, shade the soil, add biomass, create habitat for wildlife. Industrial agriculture is about creating monocultures that are dependent on chemicals and the corporations that bring those chemicals, whereas a polycultural, perennial food system, you know, there's more than 30,000 different varieties of food that we can eat, but yet in an industrial system, we've been led down the path where now pretty much all the food that we eat in the world comes from 20 crops, and 60% comes from 3: rice, wheat, and maize.
Right.
And so how can that be? It is brittle. It's such a vulnerable system. And one of the other things that we were talking about today in the food systems conference was looking at, you know, the more that we have conflicts in the world like we have right now, and the possibilities that transport routes, because we have a global food system, you know, if one of those gets blocked, all of a sudden the price of oil goes up, the price of food goes up, everything starts to unravel unless we have really resilient local food systems. Of course, we are always going to have global trade of some sort, but we need to find a way to build that local resilience, the food first and then export second. And that's really about what permaculture is about. It's like, even in your backyard, you can start to build, you know, as many different gardens, grow food forests down the street in your school garden. So bringing it back home, bringing that, and we saw that in the pandemic too, where people started to really connect around bringing the food economy home.
Right, right. So tell me quickly, Morag, what I hear from you is that permaculture is a multidisciplinary subject. But how is it finding its way into an education system which is so narrow and so specialized? So, I mean, it's a great thing that permaculture has evolved to what it is today, but how is it being actually imparted? Yeah, and is it anywhere in the mainstream today?
It's a very interesting question. Thank you, Shakti. You know, one of the things that I think is interesting about permaculture is that it has become an independent educational system that is myceliating outside of the conventional education system. It's getting passed from farmer to farmer, from community to community. You know, it just goes because it makes sense, and people pass it on because they see that it works. And so that's how it's reached around the world without any top-down organization. It's a self-organizing system that it myceliates like this, the mycelial networks underneath the soil. That's how it works. And there's power in that. Many people have taken it into different university courses, have taken it into school education. You can get a traditional form of certificate. Here in Australia and in different countries, it's also being formalized. But the main way that it's going out is people to people, farmer to farmer, grower to grower. And I think that there's a huge value in that, in recognizing that this transformative educational model doesn't have to sit within a formal structure. In actual fact, the fact that it can be dispersed and you don't have to have this sort of top-down approach gives it the strength.
Right.
Gives people access to it.
It's a big mindset shift, yeah. And it's interesting to see what you're doing, and you know, it's actually wonderful to see this taking off. And yeah, so my best wishes on your, you know, for your endeavors in this regard. Yeah, so we're now going to move to the third section of our discussion, which is on the future role of industrial food systems. So Peter, I'm going to move to you now, and can you tell us, you know, can industrial food systems be simply wished away, or is there some way in which these can be balanced with regenerative approaches? Is there a middle path somewhere?
Well, they certainly can't be just wished away. I have no doubt about that. I think one of the things that we have to consider is the human element. In the United States, and I think in many other countries, it wasn't that long ago, if you think broadly, that 30, 40, 50% of the population was involved in agriculture. And right now in the US and many other highly developed countries, it's 1 or 2% of people are involved in agriculture. So there is a change in agriculture, but there's been perhaps the largest demographic shift in history in terms of what people are doing. So that has a couple of hangover effects. One is, of course, that we have what we call the agrarian myth, that much farm policy thinks that we're still an agrarian society with a lot of small farms, and therefore pretends that, oh, we don't need any environmental oversight because they're just lovely small farms. That's the image. The reality is totally different. But because of the history, we aren't actually making sensible policy because people don't understand the reality. The second is that rural communities, which used to be vibrant, are in many parts of the world, and again, I'm more familiar with the US, are getting decimated. And as Morag said earlier, even if the production happens in rural areas, all the money is taken out, and it's heavily mechanized, it's heavily dependent on chemicals, so it uses many fewer people. And the people that are the farm workers are often not the ones who, have been in the community, and they're sort of imported farm workers, often migrant farm workers. So we're getting another demographic shift with rural communities being far less healthy than they used to be. And so I think it is important, as we think about what to do about industrial agriculture, to think about the human consequences of that. What industrial agriculture does, and what right now many want, is it produces cheap commodity food, or apparently cheap commodity food, I should say. The real price of food is far, far more. Many studies have shown it's 2, 3, 4 times what you pay at the store because of all the hidden costs of pollution and others. But it looks like it's cheap. You can go to a store and get a really cheap chicken. You can go to a McDonald's and get a really cheap hamburger. And that is what people are told they want. And many people feel that that's, they want just lots of cheap food and close their eyes to the consequences. So I think to address the industrial agriculture system, on the one hand, for example, some of what I do is I think we should treat it like an industry and address the obvious pollution. Just like we require big factories to have pollution controls, we should require big animal factories to have pollution controls. And that would help a little bit. And that would even the playing field for systems that are inherently cleaner. But to really change it, we have to have an understanding of how the industrial agriculture system is part of a larger social transformation that in many ways has been, in some ways it's been good. Not everybody wants to work on a farm, and it's a hard life sometimes. And so the fact that we don't need 50 people working in agriculture has freed up people to do other things. But in other ways, it's challenging. And so I think, as Morag said, to think of agriculture as part of a larger social transformation. And that is both important and challenging because most social change, we focus on one small thing. Can we just tweak this and things will be better? But agriculture and the food system, as we said at the beginning, affects everything. So it's hard just to tweak. But at least for me, the first tweak would be treat the industry like an industry and require it to control its pollution, because it is a major pollution source and it doesn't have to be.
So you have done a lot of work in the policy area, and we're just going to come to that in like 2 to 3 minutes. But I have another question on this topic. So Dr. James Lovelock, the late Dr. James Lovelock, who was, one of the preeminent planetary scientists, mentioned that one of the largest problems that we are facing was the acquisition of land that is being used for farming rather than chemical farming. Yeah, so he's gone on record saying that chemical farming is not as much as the culprit as the loss of biodiversity on account of acquisition of land, the deforestation that we are seeing, for example, in the Amazon. Right. So the question is that if we were to look at a regenerative agriculture, if we were to look at organic farming or syntropic farming, is that going to require more land than then that is more land than what is under cultivation today? And is that going to lead to further biodiversity loss? Can you just give us a view on that? Because you've spoken about biodiversity loss as being something which is very crucial.
I don't think you can look in isolation at how you farm as opposed to how and what you farm. The real driver of biodiversity loss is animal farming. Cows require about 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. They're hugely inefficient. If we instead grew food for people, we would need to grow much, much less food. And so the notion that we need, organic requires more land, but if we were actually growing food for people, we would need much, much less land. And if we don't need all this tremendous amount of land for cattle grazing, and by the way, cattle, because of their life cycle, always start off grazing and then they end up in a feedlot. So they both need a lot of land for grazing, and they then end up in a feedlot where they need a lot of food brought into them. And so if we change what we eat, and that's largely less meat, we actually have plenty of land to farm it in a very, very good way and produce plenty of, as Morag said at the beginning, more nutritious food. So again, the point is, it's not just how we farm, but what we farm as well as how we farm. And we have to look at those two together.
All right. Okay. Thank you. It seems to be like a really tall order, but I'm very supportive of that direction, I think, but it's interesting to see how we're going to get there. So question for both of you, very quick response to what do you see as for the next 10 to 20 years, how do you envision this entire food space? What do you think it's going to look like 10 to 20 years from now? Just a perspective from both of you. Very quick perspective.
Very quickly, I think there needs to be a big relocalization of food systems so that communities have access to food in and around where they live, whether that be in their homes or in peri-urban farms, that we focus on bioregional food systems. I think that we're going to see a massive rewilding of our farms so that, you know, the so-called ecosystem services, the pollinators, the predators that are going to help in cultivating the crops that we want and increasing the diversity of food systems. That the other thing about these multi-layered rewilded food systems too is it's actually going to help to shade the soil, to rehydrate the landscape, to restore the small water cycles and the large water cycles, which is actually going to help to improve production, because we're having massive desertification at the moment, massive soil loss, you know, massive loss of our water table. You know, when we start to rewild, we bring all of those things back again, and it helps to restart the life in the soil, all of those things. So I've seen in many places how you can actually, you know, it's not immediate, but in a space of a few years, turn things around significantly. And considering that we have climate change that is increasing the strength of storms and the unpredictability and the extent of heat and extremes, that we need to build more diverse and resilient and robust. Robust is the word that I think we need to be bringing into this, and that is those polycultural, perennial, more tree-based food systems that have the protection of the multiple layers embedded within the systems. So I think that's a couple of things.
Thank you. That's a wonderful vision. Yeah, thank you. Peter, what is your perspective?
I can't say it better than Morag did. I guess I would only offer perhaps the sad commentary that maybe many of us thought the COVID pandemic would be a boost in getting us to think about this. Some of the flaws of the industrialized, concentrated, particularly meat, but others, the rest of the food system were laid bare during the COVID pandemic, as Morag said earlier, when, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine and the big impact on fertilizer and wheat. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have created the political will for the change that's necessary yet. And so I think we have a good sense of where we want to go and where we need to go. What is less clear is what will be the catalyst for the scale of the political change that's needed. And looking at history, it's often things have to get pretty bad before they start getting better. And that's unfortunate, but the good news is when that does happen, we have a very good idea of what needs to be done. I often say in the United States, we've got great farming being done on 2 or 3% of farmland. And so it's not that we don't know what needs to be done, we accelerate adoption of those practices. And so that's our opportunity.
Can I
Peter,
just
you're also
jump in there
Go
and
ahead. Yeah,
add
go
something
ahead.
else as well on
Yes.
that? Because again, this forum, it got me thinking, all the conversations with, there was someone they called Indy Johar from the Dark Matter Labs, and he was talking about how it's probably not going to be led by community action necessarily, the level of change we need. Like, we need to have everyone acting everywhere, but where it's really going to happen is if when we start to look at, you know, the risk, the security, and actually acknowledging that an intact food system is about having a safe and secure community. And in fact, it's a form of defense. Now, if you think about how much spending we have in defense, if you could put, say, 10% of the defense budget into defending humanity and defending the land, and we know too that places that have greater levels of food insecurity, water insecurity, land insecurity are far more likely to be conflict zones as well. It is actually a real form of security and defense. So let's shift our mindset around that and find a way to access support for it through that, and get extension officers, you know, offering free agroecological education throughout the country, you know, set up demonstration centers throughout the country. Like, we could do it overnight. It just takes that political will and a little bit of a switch in our thinking. And if we have the capacity, wherever we are, whatever organization you are from, and one of the big drivers too could be shifting, you know, procurement policy. Like, where are you buying your food from? Are you in an institution? Are you in a school? Are you in a hospital? Are you in a jail? Not you in a jail, but you know, any institution that exists, where are you buying your food from? And if you start to lead from that and shift those policies, they can be real drivers for change as well.
True. Thank you both. I'm just doing a time check and I realize that we are running behind schedule. But I want to ask Peter a quick question, and then Morag a question for you. Actually, a question for both of you. So Peter, can you tell us in real brief about the work that you do? Because you are working at the policy level. You are courting Congress officials in the United States. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the policy work that you do? How are you driving policy changes?
In the United States, the big driver of agricultural policy is called the Farm Bill. It started almost 100 years ago during the Depression and the Dust Bowl. And at that time, it created a program that provided nutrition assistance and also farm assistance, because people were hungry and farms were going under. And that has stayed the two main pillars of the Farm Bill. And that has to be reauthorized in the United States every 5 years. And that provides, as I said, a lot of money for nutrition assistance. About 45 million Americans get support through it, and about $20 billion a year to farmers. And really, the simple question is, what are you paying farmers to do? $20 billion can make a big difference. And right now, many of our payments are to support large-scale monoculture chemical production of commodities, regardless of the environmental impacts. And we could use that money to encourage farmers to produce better, healthier food with fewer environmental impacts. It's really a question of how we as taxpayers and then as policymakers choose to spend that $20 billion a year. And so that's our real challenge.
So I have a final question for both of you. Yeah, thank you for that, Peter. It's see, both of you are working for a common cause, but you approach it from two very different ends of the spectrum. So question for both of you is, how do we build bridges between policy intervention and building a groundswell of change?
Well, I'll answer that quickly, which is I don't think they're opposite ends of the spectrum. By far the most effective advocates in Congress are people who are trying to do the right thing and are struggling because right now all policy supports encourages farmers to do destructive behaviors. And so when they go to talk to a policymaker and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, and I have my workers are healthy and happy and well taken care of, and we're producing good food and we're enriching the soil, and yet we get no support and our competitors get all the money and are crushing us. They are very effective spokespeople. And so I think a lot of what we need to do is elevate their voice, because right now policymakers hear from the 4 big companies that control all the seeds, or the 4 big companies that control all the meat slaughter, or the 4 big companies that control much of the agricultural machinery. That's who they hear from. We need to get them to hear from the people like Morag and her network that are trying to do something different and better.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Morag, what is your take on this? And then we're going to move to the audience Q&A. There's a whole lot of questions that we've got.
Sorry, I got so involved in Peter's answer, I forgot what your question was.
Well, how do you build bridges between policy intervention and a groundswell of change?
Well, I mean, you know, building on what Peter just said, I mean, really it's about being in conversation. There is so much that's going on that's positive absolutely everywhere. And there are people like Peter who are, you know, supporting from the angle that he does. You know, the conversations that we had this morning were we had government, business, NGOs coming together and actually spotlighting what's going on the ground, and elevating those voices and connecting those, I think, is one way to do it. And I do feel like there's the readiness for something else. And I don't think, you know, I think the big 4 also know that things are getting really bad and that things are going to need to shift. And there's a grasping that's happening, but it's the grasping that's a little bit dangerous. So I think it's really important at this point to be really looking to it, how we can shift some subsidies, and find ways for getting the voices of all of these different projects from people who are the producers, from people who are the processors, the growers, all together to be in that space. And it means we all need to step up and speak up, and not just be, you know, there's a comment in the questions about, well, you know, small farms just can't make it. Yes, we need to do education, we need to do processing, we need to do a whole lot of things. But actually, just on that point, you know, the reason small farmers can't make a living is because and the reason the big ones do, they get such big subsidies to support them. Like they would, if their subsidies didn't exist, if they got equal amounts of subsidies, you know, the small organic farmer would actually be more viable. So, you know, let's just look at that. You know, there's fossil fuel subsidies, there's transportation subsidies, there's all different sorts of subsidies that are hidden. They're not there, visible. Right. And, you know, there's the environmental subsidy, you know, the environment, nature is subsidizing that food. Right. Our health is subsidizing that food. So they're not viable at all. They're totally unviable, in fact.
Health is subsidizing. I think that's a very very bold statement, but also very true. Yes, thank you for that. So we're going to move to the audience Q&A, and we had received more than 15, almost 15 to 20 questions in advance, and I see we've got, I think, 11 questions right now in the Q&A chat. So I'm going to start first with some of the ones that I got in advance. And Peter and Morag, please feel free to type out some of the answers, you know, to the questions that are in the Q&A chat, whilst the other one of you is addressing or speaking. So I'm going to first, there's been actually, the questions that have come from the audience have been quite interesting. and they are from a very different dimension. And many questions that we've got are from, in the realm of nutrition and lifestyle. So this question, a very fundamental question that's been asked by Hamsa Vardhan Preset and Mamta Gautam from India. What constitutes a properly balanced and healthy diet, and what best practices would you recommend?
Well, I will answer quickly to say I'm not a nutritionist, but generally the advice I've heard is as much diversity as you can. If you just have a very, very diverse, eat lots of different things, you're probably going to have a pretty healthy diet. But again, I'm not a nutritionist, but that I think is a good rule of thumb.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right. I also think the closer it is from when it's harvested to when it reaches your plate is also a really big part of improving the nutritional quality of the food that we get. So closer to home, fresher food that's not been stored a long time or transported long distances. And yeah, so that's another little snip. I know we've got lots of questions, so we could answer each one in a really long thing, but we'll just.
So there's a question from Lauren Elizabeth Clare from the US, and she asks, what shifts in lifestyle will help shift the paradigm from sustainability to regeneration? And also a question from Pragati Sadhana, India, related. How do we boost a lifestyle that encourages local regional food? So you've established the case for a lifestyle, but the question is, how do we make that shift? That's the question that is being asked.
Well, I think there's a mixture of people thinking about themselves. They think about their immediate community, and then they perhaps think about their broader community. And one of the important things that is to recognize, I think, is that our current food, as we said at the beginning, while maybe appearing cheap, is actually quite unhealthy. And so people will often think about change when they think about their own health. They may also think about their family or their very local community and recognize that the food system isn't doing much for that. Whether it be, what am I feeding to my children? So I think we have to keep making all of these points. I often say the simplest thing is to try to eat a lot less processed food and eat a lot less meat. Those are eat more plants, the fresher, the localer, the better. It's, again, a simple rule of thumb.
I think I agree with everything that Peter's saying. And, in terms of thinking about how to make that change, I speak to a lot of people around the world, and something that is quite common, it comes forward is, the love of our family, like, how is it for our children and our children's children, and how will they live? And that sense of loss too, when you think, oh, well, I remember as a kid, I could walk down through the bushland, down to that little stream at the bottom of the lane, and there was this little rivulet, and I could collect the tadpoles, and it's not there now because it's paved over. Like that loss of connection with the natural world, the loss of the farm that was on the edge of the field. I remember even myself, as I used to travel across to my grandmother's place, we went through orchards, and now it's just Orchard Lane, with massive houses. There's no orchards left. There's this sense of loss, and we feel it in our, we feel it quite intensely, this loss of nature. And by recognizing that, and recognizing that our children as well need to have that deep experience of nature to feel whole and to be well, reach out and try and find ways to make that shift. Another way that I found that another sense of loss is when people become really ill. A lot of people come to this work because, their partner has died, or their parents have suffered cancer, or themselves have been deeply impacted by it, and have come from a point of crisis, a personal crisis, and thought, okay, now it's really time to change. I didn't listen to the warnings, but it's finally hit, and now I actually am making the change. And they become like huge advocates because they understand. There was like one farmer that I worked with in South Korea, and he was a rice farmer using chemicals, and he was spraying everywhere, no protection, and he got cancer. And then he was told by the doctors, look, mate, you shouldn't really eat the food that you're growing. And then he went, this is ridiculous. And so his whole valley ended up going organic because of his crisis. He advocated for that. So people who've gone through that crisis end up becoming leaders and spokespeople and bringing awareness and telling the story. I think storytelling, sharing what's personally going on is hugely powerful, and people resonate to that sharing of those personal stories.
So in many cases like this, there is a tipping point, and you just shared one tipping point that occurred with this farmer in this particular valley. Yeah, thank you, Morag. I'm pretty overwhelmed with the number of questions that we have. I'm going to try and bunch them together. There's 3 questions on a identical topic. Bhavna Nisima has raised this in the Q&A chat, and she says, could you both provide examples of urban permaculture? I'm thinking especially in context of Indian metropolises that are packed and with massive real estate competition. And related to that is another question by Ghulam Hussain Tayabali from India, who asks, what is the scope of raised beds for vegetable farming? And there's another question, again, a related question from John Theo from Singapore. And he asks, how might we adopt permaculture practices in a cosmopolitan city-state? So just bunching these 3 together, can either of you or both of you respond to urban permaculture in an urban context?
I'll have a crack to start with. So the well, we can begin on our bench tops in our kitchens. You know, we can grow microgreens on a windowsill. We can grow pots there. We can start to bring the food right in home, on our balconies, on our rooftops, in our courtyards. We can plant a tree in the street, or maybe there's a schoolyard or a churchyard or a community park that can be transformed, a verge garden. What we need to do is to apply this sort of food lens, a permaculture lens, as we walk through the landscape and imagine what's possible. And often we have this sense that, well, we can't do anything, but we can create. And so, Bhavana, hi, one of the things that I've seen work a lot is this notion of temporary gardens or garden installations where, you know, there might be a spot that's vacant for a while, and we can create like sack gardens in those places that can be moved to another spot later on. And just by those installations of those gardens, people get to know and feel and see them and go, this is great. There's something really special about this. And then it starts to take off. So just finding niches that's possible, and then start to think about, well, in Hong Kong, for example, where it's really dense in the middle of the city, they have what they call weekend farms. So around the edge of the city, some of the small farmers are doing organic farming, and a way for them to actually make extra money is they rent out plots for urban dwellers. They come out on the weekend, do some farming. During the week, the farmer looks after their plot for them. So it's good for the farmer, and it's good for the urban dweller. They get to spend time out in nature and out in the farm, and they come and get whatever they're able to grow, and then the farmer produces a box for them. So it's about having a relationship between the urban and the rural, or the peri-urban and the rural as well. So I think that's one way. Raised beds are great I don't know what kind of raised beds we're talking about, but I always advocate for putting things in the ground as much as possible. Here in Australia, there's this tendency to want to put everything up in metal edged gardens, and what it does is it just heats everything up. If we put things in the ground and feed the soil, tend the soil, add organic matter, and really find a way to grow as much there. But if it's contaminated soil, then in a highly urbanized area, I probably would think about doing raised beds or pots or some sort of some way that you can be composting your food waste, turning it into soil that then you can grow. I mean, we have so much resources. We don't have to spend money to do this in the cities. We can just make it with what we have around us. It's incredible the amount of resources we've got, from cuttings and seeds and offcuts from our gardens, from our food that we buy as well. Like the end of a sweet potato plant, that you've got another sweet potato. you know, the seeds from a tomato, plant them and you've got some more tomatoes. Like we don't have to buy a whole lot of things to make this happen. We've already got most of the resources we need.
Thank you. Thank you, Morag. There's a question from Andrea Revel from the UK. Now, this is a question that she asked earlier. She's also on the webinar right now, and she's typed another question here, but this is a question that she asked earlier. And she said, how can we make regenerative farming profitable enough for farmers so it leads to a greater adoption? And also, I could just add to that, how do we also make it affordable? Because right now, organic farming is a rich person's food. You know, you're paying a premium for organic farming produce. So how do we make it profitable and affordable? You're on mute, Peter. I think you're on mute.
In terms of the profitable, I mentioned earlier that our coffee farm is Rainforest Alliance certified.
Right.
And the way a certification program works is if we conform to certain standards, we get the certification, and then consumers who care, not all of them, but often 20 or 30% of consumers who are willing to pay a little more for a product that they think is a little better. And then that premium that the consumer pays willingly, hopefully most of that gets back to the farmer, doesn't get siphoned off along the way. So one way to make it more profitable is that there's at least some pretty big section of consumers that are willing to pay more for better food. They want their food to reflect their values. I think a second area is to recognize that, again, I'm going to use United States numbers, that the actual producer gets about 7 or 8 cents of the food dollar. So when you spend $1 at the store or at a restaurant, 7 or 8 cents of that gets to the farmer, and the rest of it goes to the pesticide manufacturer and to the slaughterhouse and to the distributors and all the other parts of the food chain. And if you just think about that, that means there's 92 cents of money for every $1 going to folks other than the farmer. And so that's where we should look for ways to make sure our food remains affordable. And local, as Morag said, local is part of that, but there are many, many other aspects. For example, in the United States, there's talk about antitrust effort. When 4 companies control 85% of the market, they can set the price. And that is not necessarily the case if you had 100 different companies. So a lot of opportunities, but that's where the focus should be, not on saying the farmer should get even less than 8 cents.
Yeah. And I think also, Shakti, just in response to that too, and I guess adding another dimension to what Peter just said, is that one way to bring the price of organic produce down is by reducing the distance and reducing the bits that get pulled out of the middle. So how can you bring producer and consumer together? So maybe CSA, farmers markets, food box systems, some other way of taking that middle bit out and just bringing the producers and the consumers much closer. And so, you know, I'm part of a local food cooperative here where I get bulk foods. And so there's no gouging of that. I'm part of a dairy collective here. So we just have 4 or 5 people who milk the cows. And, you know, once a week, it's my turn. I go and milk the cow, get the milk, and then I grow all my greens in the garden. So that's free. So there's different ways of, you know, do as much as you can where you are. What you can't grow yourself, then support a local farmer or a regional farmer, and as directly as possible, so there's not as much taking out of it. And it's finding those integrations and the relationships that becomes possible. And it takes a little bit maybe to set up. Maybe there's one that's already set up that you could join and support. But you know, to be a leader in this kind of regenerative food movement takes more than just the grower. It takes the consumer, it takes the organizers, it takes the people who want to really be part of changing the food economy, changing the food system. And that means that, you know, we all need to become part of the farming community. And it's not just that 1% or 2% of farmers left on the land like in the States or here in Australia, that the more of us who recognize that farming is all of us. It is
True.
food, what sustains us. Food's what
True.
connects us to nature. And
That's right.
it
Right.
shifts our perception.
I often say we need to get eaters more involved in farm policy. After all, this is producing food that we all eat.
Right.
And I would say one other thing in terms of your affordability question, Shakti, is that going back to what I said, every government in the world heavily subsidizes agriculture. What we choose to subsidize makes a big difference. In the United States, we choose to subsidize largely meat and industrial crops. If we instead chose to subsidize healthy, good, local, well sustainably produced food, that price difference, the bad food would cost more and the good food would cost less.
Thank you for unearthing that lacuna. It is, it's great that you brought that out. I know we more or less over time, but there are two questions that if I could just ask you before we wrap up today. There's one question from William Foster from the UK, and it's a very pertinent question. And he says, if white-collar degree-educated workers have trouble understanding the recycling difference between a plastic cup and a paper one, how do we get enough people to get onto permaculture principles? Yeah, that's a question for you, Morag. How would you respond to William?
Well,
Keep at it.
what was that, sorry, Peter? Did you?
I said, keep at it.
Yeah, and I think some people are just followers and other people are leaders. And perhaps the person who's not recognizing the cup issue is just going to follow. So if you in your office then set up that purchasing policy so that all the food is, local organic food, or all the cups are completely compostable, then they're just going to have to follow along with it. So I think, you lead by example, you take people on the journey, you set the direction rather than trying to whip people into action who are just not ready yet, or haven't seen enough, or don't understand, or haven't connected to the issues. Like, it takes a lot of times to see something before you get it, before you understand it. And so don't try and make people feel bad. Lead people and invite people to come and join you in this different way of doing things, and make it enjoyable, make it attractive. It's hard to try. You can't make people change unless it's a whole systems shift that happens.
Right. Thank you, Morag. Go ahead, Peter.
Really important, Shakti, is to understand, if you want people to understand the truth, one element is to stop the lying. And for example, the plastics industry has been sued very often for greenwashing, for making false claims about what plastic is recyclable, isn't recyclable, what recycling means. So part of the reason people are confused about recycling is because the plastics industry has done their damnedest to make sure people are confused. And the exact same is in the food system. We actually just sued Tyson yesterday, the world's second largest meat company, for greenwashing. About 6 months ago, the New York Attorney General sued JBS, the world's largest beef company, for greenwashing, for lying basically, or for misleading consumers about the climate impact of their product, of meat. And so part of the reason people are confused is because the big companies are trying to confuse them, and we should all be pushing back on the intentionally misleading statements that they're making.
All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well done for that.
I have
That's
one
great.
final question. I'm posing it because it's just a very powerful question, and then we close the webinar. It's from Jaden Tetley Rana from Australia, and this is a question actually for both of you. If you could make one universal law that everyone had to follow for agriculture, what would it be?
Wow.
I would say observe and interact, follow the permaculture principles, basically. Like, it's observe and interact with what is locally there, to be locally specific, to tend to what fits with your local environment, your local soil. If it was one thing, just one thing, say, grow your soil, tend to your soil, care for your soil, begins with the soil.
Peter, you?
I'm not sure I can answer that, but what I do know is if one goes into many undisturbed areas, there is tremendous diversity, and that's where you have healthy plants and healthy soil. And I think that's often viewed as a very, very critical element of a healthier food system. So both for what we eat and what we grow, and so I'd say go for diversity.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Morag, and thank you, Peter. And thank you to our audience for being here with us today. Now, I know that every question has not been answered. There's still many questions that have been, unanswered, the ones that have been posted in the Q&A chat, and even the ones that have been posted earlier. But I have shared in the chat both Morag and Peter's email IDs. So please feel free to connect with either one of them, and they have both offered their emails. And should you have a question, something which you feel that you really want that answer, please reach out to either of them or to both of them. And hopefully they will give you an answer. They will respond to you. Both busy people, but I'm sure they will respond to you. Yeah, so once again, I want to thank both of you, Morag and Peter, as a token of appreciation for your efforts and for being with us on this webinar today. SHAKTIFY is going to be planting 5 saplings on behalf of each of you in India, in some state in India. You will have the details tomorrow. This is through a foundation called Sankalp Taru Foundation, and you will get the details of that by tomorrow. Yes, so once again to our audience and to all of you today, thank you for being with us for this webinar. I wish you all a good rest of a good evening, the rest of it, and a good day for those of you in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, thank you and bye for now.